My name is Dahlia Wasfi. I was born in New York, but spent my early childhood in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. My father is originally from Basra, Iraq, which is Iraq's second largest city in the south near the border with Kuwait. He was born and raised there, came to the U.S. for graduate studies, where he met the woman who would be my mom, nice Jewish girl from New York. So I was born in New York, lived my early childhood between Iraq and the States, and then came back and lived my life since 1977 here in the States, which is why I have this accent rather than a foreign one. And I've been back to Iraq now twice, for 3 weeks in 2004 and for 3 months in 2006. And on the basis of my experiences, I call for the immediate unconditional withdrawal of American forces from Iraq. My talk today is the effects of war and occupation on Iraqi farmers, basically that there ain't nothing green about the green zone. All right, let's back up a little further than 1971. This is between 2000 and 3000 BC. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the green zone. The Fertile Crescent, outlined for you in green. Obviously, tracking the paths of the two major rivers that run through Iraq, modern-day Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates. This is, of course, Mesopotamia back in the day. And just as a note, you can see in the lower left-hand corner that between 2000 and 3000 BC, that's Palestine. Israel was a state created in 1948. But also in this image, you can see in the lower right-hand corner the major early cities of civilization. This region is known as the Fertile Crescent. It's known as the cradle of civilization. And sorry, I don't have my pointer. Here's my pointer. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, if you're close enough, the city of Ur, Sumer, and Babylon. Now, the land of Mesopotamia was once troubled by significant flooding, which limited the amount of farming that was possible. But today, the land is mostly desert. And farmers made efforts to control the floods so that they could build their crops. And today they have to deal with the desert conditions. But farming in ancient Iraq goes back for 10,000 years, back to 8000 BC. And this influenced development of the whole society. These were the first farmers, the ancestors of the people who live in Iraq today. And farming led to development of clothing, trade and commerce, and writing. For clothing, the people used wool, or they grew flax and made clothes from those materials. The farmers at that time, the very first farmers, they invented irrigation. And so for the very first time, thanks to irrigation, there was a surplus of crops to trade for goods and services. They were using the barter system, which, depending on how fast the dollar devalues, we may be going back to the barter system shortly. Writing was also developed by those first farmers, because with the surplus of crops, they needed a means to keep track of their selling and buying, and also how much they had. So they kept records for livestock and records for commerce, and this was cuneiform, the first system of writing. Now, some of you may not know, I didn't know until I started researching it, that modern-day Iraq is the site of the biblical Garden of Eden. I see heads nodding. That's so, thank you for that. And most people, this should have been discussed at the time that we were getting ready to shock and awe. Abraham, considered the father of the three major monotheistic religions, was from Ur. Now, my dad says Abraham was an Iraqi. That might be pushing it a little bit, but nevertheless, this is a connection that most of us have to this part of the world. As I said, the major early civilizations, these are the people who developed the concept of the 24-hour day, the basis of writing, the first system of mathematics. These are, of course, Arabic numerals that we use. The basis of law, science, and medicine, actually 7,000 years of civilization. That was all accomplished without the help of any Americans or British. It's true. It's true. It happened. This is a pictorial of what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have looked like, built by Nebuchadnezzar II in 600 BC, for many years classified as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Actually, this was not built through a no-bid contract to Halliburton. So I just want to assure you that if you're concerned about what will happen with the reconstruction of Iraq when American businesses and the military leave, I feel confident that the descendants of the people who did this can probably come up with something. All right, farming in modern-day Iraq. We're going to fast forward about 9,000 years. In the 20th century, it was predominantly traditional, family, multi-crop farming. Now, since the 1950s, Iraq was known as the date supplier to the world, with producing over 400 kinds of Iraqi dates. I remember when I was little, I thought I was going to get in so much trouble because I picked up something off the ground that looked like chocolate, and I ate it, and it tasted like chocolate, but it was a date. I never told anybody because I picked it up off the ground and ate it. But anyway, flourishing date agriculture sector. Once over 35 million date palms in Iraq, now according to the Department of Defense, less than 15 million, thanks to the occupation. Now the 1970s, this was the time when my family was living there. I was there between 71 and 77. This was, relatively speaking, these were the golden days for Iraq. The Ba'ath Party, under the direction of Saddam Hussein, who was technically the #2 guy, but he was really running the country. They nationalized oil between the years of 72 to 75, and fast forwarding a little bit, 2003 was payback for Iraqis taking control of their resources and, God forbid, earning profits for the people who lived in their country. At the time, one Iraqi dinar was the equivalent of over $3 American, and the dollar was doing pretty good at that point. Now, there was political repression, no question. If you challenged the regime, or if anybody got a whisper that you were challenging the regime or the Ba'ath Party, something would happen to you. You would be jailed, tortured, imprisoned, disappeared, who knows. So absolutely, you knew you had to watch what you would say and be careful not to ask the wrong questions. But if you remained apolitical, the economy was doing very well, and there was free healthcare and free education all the way up until 2003. Now, in the 1980s, we left in 77. 3 years later, in 1980, the Iran-Iraq War started. Then Iraq shifted to a war-based economy, which is essentially what we've been operating in since the 1940s, at least. Basra was heavily bombarded. Basra, there were a lot of contested areas very close to the border with Iran there and the Fao Peninsula. So Basra was hit very hard. So we actually could not go back during that time because it was wartime. But my cousins told me that electricity supplies, water supplies, food supply generally remained stable. And now this war continued for 8 years through most of the 80s with the contribution of American funding and armaments for Iraq over the table, for Iran under the table. Little secret we kept from Congress, but that was the whole Iran-Contra scandal. Oh, people. December 20th, 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, then private citizen, special envoy to President Reagan, reaffirming our close ties with our ally in the Gulf, Saddam Hussein on your right. People, you can feel the love in this picture. December 20th, 1983, the Iran-Iraq war is well underway. Saddam Hussein is using the chemical, biological, and conventional weapons that we're providing him with, as well as satellite intelligence. This should have been plastered all over the news when Rumsfeld was calling him a tyrant worse than Hitler. Not that he hadn't earned a reputation for being a brutal tyrant. That was well deserved. But clearly, at some point, it didn't make a difference to us. After the 1980s, Iraq was preparing a $40 billion reconstruction program. But then for reasons I can't go into, I don't have time to flesh out right now, Iraqi troops moved into Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. What resulted was economic sanctions imposed on Iraq 4 days later, August 6th, which I'll come back to, and subsequently the Gulf War that began on January 17th, 1991. It continued for 42 days. Now, I currently live in Denver, Colorado, because I grew up on the East Coast, and I don't deal well with 3 consecutive days of rain. We bombed the people of Iraq for 6 straight weeks. No let-up. 88,500 tons of bombs. We did target electrical grids, we did target water sewage treatment plants, we did target telecommunication centers, all of which are illegal by the Geneva Conventions. The public health infrastructure was destroyed because it was known as the jewel of the Arab world, a first world system of healthcare. I didn't know until I started doing the research, but Iraq actually had a healthy tourist industry for people coming to get their medical care in Iraq. But as you can imagine, in the first world system we have in this country, take away electricity and spill sewage in the streets, and what do you have? You have massive disease outbreak, communicable diseases, and you're unable to run your hospitals. We also use depleted uranium. I will come back to this. And this basically was the beginning of the devastation of life for Iraqis. Moving on a little further, the period of August 1990 through March 18th, 2003, the day before shock and awe, was characterized by suffering imposed by economic sanctions, bombings, marsh drainage, and drought. So let me start with the sanctions. As I said, they were imposed on Iraq 4 days after Iraqi troops moved into Kuwait, actually on the anniversary of another government's targeting of a civilian population, the 45th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. What those sanctions did was blocked Iraq from selling its oil, which was 95% of the economy. This also blocked the import of goods. There was no new, from the farming standpoint, no new agricultural equipment coming in. And any equipment that needed to be repaired, infrastructure that needed to be repaired, this was not possible because of economic sanctions. The food rationing program in Iraq was started at this time, and I want you to keep that in mind because I'm going to come back to that. This was the food rationing program that was begun in 1990 and persists through this day, and in the chaos and displacement and starvation that's happening in Iraq, many Iraqis are relying on what's left of the food rationing program to survive today. By 1995, 5 years of economic sanctions, what was found was that those sanctions were yielding a minimum of political dividends against a high human price paid primarily by women and children. Now, do the math with me. Take any country, any population, about half male, half female. Add up the women, the girls, and the boys. That's the majority of the people. Anywhere you go, women and children. And women and children were paying the highest price, as they are today. Now, what would we do if another country's policy affected, primarily targeted, women and children? We'd be hopping mad. The food rationing system at this time was providing less than 60% of the required daily caloric intake. People were starving. Saddam Hussein got fat during this time. He wasn't hurting. The regime wasn't hurting, and in fact his power was reinforced because people were that much more desperate to and dependent upon him for their survival. So we actually strengthened his rule with the years of sanctions, but the people suffered. Which people? The same people who suffer today in Fallujah, the same people who suffer today in New Orleans, those who are very young, very old, very weak, very sick, very poor. These are the elements. This is the population that suffers the most. Water and sanitation systems were still in a state of collapse. This is a study in 1995 by UNICEF. So what this study led to was the Oil for Food program that was supposed to start in December 1996. As we all know, even if it had been working 100%, it would have been a drop in the bucket to satisfy the needs of the Iraqi people. But we know it was rife with corruption. As I told you, Saddam Hussein was making a lot of money, selling oil on the black market. Who was he selling it to? At that time, Dick Cheney was CEO of Halliburton. Everybody's getting a cut. There was also, through this time, an intellectual embargo. Not only were foods and services and any imports blocked from entering the country, but also journals, medical journals, agricultural journals. So no new farming technology was coming into Iraq. By 1997, UNICEF found that nearly 1 million children in southern and central Iraq were chronically malnourished. And the reason I'm going through all this is because this is the state of Iraq. This was the setup before we came in 2003. This is an increase of 72% since 1991, when American forces and an embargo were involved. And the UNICEF rep in Baghdad said, "It is clear that children are bearing the brunt of the current economic hardship. Those children are now young teenagers, and they will be ripe to join the resistance when all they know of Americans are those planes that drop bombs and the political people who starve them to death." So this is the result of malnutrition in Iraq. Iraq, again, prior to the 1980s, was emerging as a first world country. The 70s were very good, but today, starvation. You could see, and to this day, see anywhere from between 2 and 5 babies in one incubator. Number one, they fit. Number two, if an incubator breaks, they can't get